Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America and leave a comment with what you'd like to see next. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are whispers that never made it into the official record of Kentucky. A story so poisonous, so blackened by shame, that the only place it survived was in late-night conversations between old men on back porches, or in pastors, warnings to restless children who wandered too far from home. They say in one forgotten county, buried deep in the backwoods, two sisters not only lived under their father's shadow, but were bound to him in the most forbidden way. Not as daughters, but as wives. This is not the sort of tale a town carves into stone markers or keeps in proud family Bibles. It is the kind of story people torch. Hopping the smoke will carry their disgrace into the sky. And yet, the truth has a way of bleeding back through old courthouses with cracked floors, family cemeteries hidden by weeds, and yellowed newspaper scraps. If you're willing to search, the evidence lingers like the faint smell of rot in an abandoned cabin. Tonight, we peel back the rotted boards of Kentucky folklore to uncover what may be the most disturbing story of inbreeding to ever take root on American soil: the sisters who married their father. This tale begins, as many do, with a patriarch who believed blood was a chain to bind, rather than a bond to honor. In the hills, men like him held their families not with love but with fear, turning kinship into property. And from that belief something monstrous was born, an arrangement so grotesque that even the Bible-quoting preachers who tolerated a great deal of sin could not speak of it aloud. The old-timers whispered that the family's cabin stood alone at the edge of a dark river, its windows boarded, not to keep people out, but to keep secrets in. Behind those walls, daughters became brides, and bloodlines folded in on themselves until the names on the family tree blurred into one. And here is where the silence begins to suffocate. How much of this is folklore and how much is fact? That's the razor's edge we'll walk together tonight. Because Kentucky's past, like all of America's past, is not just about pioneers and progress. It's about the shadows that families locked inside, hoping no one would ever dare to look. The family at the center of this tale did not live in the bustling towns where gossip could spread too freely. No, they chose isolation. Their cabin stood several miles from the nearest church, perched on land that was more rock than soil, where crops barely survived and neighbors seldom visited. In those days, the isolation of the hills was both a shield and a trap. It protected families from outside judgment, but it also allowed sins to fester, unchecked, behind closed doors. The father, whose name has been lost or scrubbed from most official records, was known as a hard man, quick to temper and slow to mercy. Men like him ruled their households absolutely, with no law strong enough to reach through the trees and no neighbor willing to intervene. In the backwoods of Kentucky, the family patriarch was sheriff, preacher, and judge, all in one. And when such a man decided his word was law, there was no higher court to appeal to. Whispers say that after his wife passed, or perhaps she simply vanished without explanation, the daughters took her place. At first, the town may have looked the other way, dismissing the arrangement as rumor or telling themselves that mountain people had their own ways. But over time, the truth grew harder to deny. The girls bore children, and those children carried features that unsettled even the most weathered locals. Too close, they said, too familiar. The same jawlines, the same deep-set eyes, repeating generation after generation until the children looked less like individuals and more like reflections in a cracked mirror. By the way, which city are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments below. Some old accounts claim the sisters were no older than 14 or 15 when their father began treating them as brides. It was not framed as love but as obedience. A daughter's duty, warped into a wife's burden. And the terrifying part is that in their world there was no escape. To leave the father was to leave the land, the roof, the food, the only protection from the harshness of the frontier. So they remained bound not only by blood but by survival. By the time locals began to whisper openly, the family had become a kind of curse in the county. Farmers passing their land would avert their eyes, muttering prayers under their breath. Yet even in their disgust, no one stopped him. Perhaps fear of violence kept them away. Perhaps it was simply easier to pretend it wasn't happening. And in that silence, the cycle continued. Daughters, wives, mothers, and victims, all trapped in the same collapsing house of blood. The strangest thing about stories like these is how they manage to slip between folklore and fact, leaving us grasping at fragments. County records from that era are incomplete, riddled with gaps where names should be, years missing, births and deaths unrecorded. Yet every so often, a sliver of evidence pushes through the soil. An old church ledger with suspiciously repeated surnames, a midwife's account of children born too frail to live, or a judge's note hinting at unnatural relations in the hills. These fragments, pieced together, paint a picture too grotesque to dismiss entirely. The family became something of a legend, not because people admired them but because they terrified them. Children were warned never to wander near their cabin. Some claimed the sisters would appear at night, barefoot in the woods, their dresses torn, their eyes vacant, as if they no longer knew who they were. Daughters, wives, or something in between. The father, meanwhile, was said to patrol the property with a rifle slung over his shoulder, daring anyone to approach. And then there were the children, born of blood too tightly knotted, carrying the weight of their origin in every fragile step. Old-timers whispered that some had limbs too short, spines that curved unnaturally, or minds that never developed past infancy. They rarely lived long, and when they died, the ground behind the cabin filled with small, unmarked graves. The family buried them quickly, under cover of night, shoveling earth as though erasing proof of their existence could erase the shame itself. What makes this story particularly haunting is the way the town responded, or rather, failed to respond. Neighbors and church leaders would whisper in private but speak nothing aloud. This was not ignorance. It was a choice. Confronting the truth meant acknowledging that such evil could take root within their own county too, their own people. And so they looked away, pretending not to hear the cries from the woods, not to notice the stench of freshly turned soil behind the cabin. Folklore calls this family cursed, but perhaps the curse was not supernatural at all. Perhaps it was the curse of silence, the collective decision of a community to do nothing. Because silence, when left unbroken, becomes its own form of complicity. And in that complicity, the father's grip only grew stronger, turning what should have been daughters into prisoners of his will. The deeper you look into Kentucky's forgotten corners, the more this story resembles a cycle rather than a single scandal. The father did not just shatter the lives of his daughters. He reshaped the entire bloodline. When daughters become wives, and their children are both sons and brothers, the very structure of family collapses. It ceases to function as lineage and instead becomes a closed loop, a spiral sinking deeper into itself. Accounts suggest that the daughters, though trapped, bore their father multiple children over the years. Some lived long enough to take spouses of their own, though here too, the pattern twisted. These children born of blurred bloodlines were rarely accepted by the outside world. They were mocked, rejected, or simply ignored. And so they too turned inward, pairing within the same small pool, until the family became less like a tree branching outward and more like a knot tightening upon itself. Whispers of this family spread further than their county. Traveling salesmen, preachers on circuit rides, and even court clerks carried the story into surrounding towns. But each time the tale moved, it grew hazier. Was it one father, or many generations of fathers repeating the same sin? Were there two sisters, or three? Did they live by the river, or at the foot of the mountain? The uncertainty allowed people to dismiss it as rumor if they chose to. And yet the details that remained consistent: daughters forced into marriage with their own blood, children born broken, graves dug too often, suggested a core truth that could not be ignored. The image of the cabin became symbolic. Folks said its windows were always shuttered, the curtains never drawn back, as though the house itself refused to let the outside world look in. Hunters spoke of hearing strange hymns sung at night, voices high and wavering, not quite in harmony. Some believed the family had twisted religion itself into a justification, citing passages about obedience and submission to keep the daughters chained to their fate. Whether fact or folklore, the story has the texture of something lived, too detailed to be pure invention, too disturbing to have been proudly recorded. And it is this uncertainty that haunts, the possibility that what the county tried to bury was not simply scandal, but evidence of how far the human mind can bend when isolation, fear, and power intertwine. By the time this family story seeped into Kentucky folklore, it was already more ghost than history. The father had aged, his body bent, but his will unbroken, ruling over the cabin like a decaying king. The sisters, worn down by years of obedience, were described as hollow-eyed, their voices soft and resigned, their lives reduced to the performance of roles they never chose. What began as horror had calcified into routine, an arrangement so twisted it became ordinary within those walls. The children carried the greatest burden. Some accounts suggest they were not sent to school, kept instead within the cabin, as if the outside world might infect them with freedom. Locals swore they caught glimpses of them in the woods, pale figures with vacant stares, stumbling as though the earth itself resisted their steps. Each generation seemed weaker than the last, as though nature itself rebelled against the family's defiance of its laws. And yet, the cycle dragged on, year after year, grave after grave. Here lies the question that gnaws at us. How could this continue for so long? Why did no one intervene? The unsettling answer is that the silence of the community was as strong as the father's grip. In rural Kentucky of that era, family matters were considered untouchable. To accuse a man of such sins was to invite violence, scandal, and shame upon everyone. It was easier always to close your mouth, to avert your eyes, to let the evil rot behind another man's door, so long as it didn't spill into your own. Folklore never forgets. The story became a warning told around firesides, a lesson for daughters and sons alike. Obey your parents, but not too blindly. Trust your kin, but not too much. Like many old American tales, it twisted morality into fear, shaping behavior through whispered horrors. The father and his daughters may have died generations ago. Their names were never the point. It was the pattern, the reminder that darkness can hide in the very structure meant to protect you, that lingered. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, bound by survival, or would you have risked everything to break free? When you think of the family's cabin now, imagine not a home, but a mausoleum that people still lived inside. The walls were said to be stained with smoke from decades of firewood, the air heavy with mildew and rot. Some claim the sisters kept portraits of their dead mother on the mantel, though covered in dust, as if she still watched, silently, while her place in the household was erased. Every detail spoke not of life, but of slow decay. The strangest accounts describe how the sisters themselves began to change. They were no longer simply victims, but became enforcers of the father's will. When daughters are raised under a system of fear, some learn to survive by joining it. Neighbors whispered that one sister would guard the other, ensuring no one tried to run. Others claimed the women spoke of their arrangement with a kind of weary pride, insisting it was God's will, that obedience was salvation. This is how trauma rewrites the mind. It convinces its captives that the prison is sacred, that the chains are a form of protection. But children see through such lies. The children born of these unions were said to be restless, defiant, prone to strange fits of anger or withdrawal. Some wandered to the nearest church and begged food from strangers, their speech halting, their eyes darting like frightened animals. Others simply disappeared into the woods, never to return. Were they lost? Were they buried? No one asked too loudly. In silence there is safety. The legacy of this family is not only biological, it is psychological. The horror was not confined to their bodies, but carved deep into their minds. Imagine being a child raised in that cabin, where the man you call father is also your grandfather, where your mother is also your aunt. How do you build a sense of self when even the words for family collapse into nonsense? This confusion is a prison stronger than any locked door, one that binds generation after generation. And this is where Kentucky folklore takes on its darkest edge. For some say the family's curse did not end with the father's death. His daughters, conditioned by years of fear and obedience, carried the pattern forward. When he was gone, they became the matriarchs of a bloodline that still resisted the world outside. To this day, some families in the hills are whispered about as kin too close, their features eerily similar, their eyes carrying the same hollow shadow. As the years passed, the father's name faded and the sisters' faces vanished from memory. The cabin itself eventually collapsed, swallowed by weeds and vines. The roof caved in until only a foundation of stones marked where the family once lived. Nature does not tolerate corruption forever. It reclaims. It erases. Yet even now, the story has not died. It lingers like a bitter taste in Kentucky's folklore. Half denied, half believed. Old-timers still speak of the cursed sisters, usually in whispers, as if nomming them too loudly might call their ghosts back. Some say their descendants walk among us, carrying traces of their origin in their bone structure, in the way they keep to themselves, in the silence that clings to them like a second skin. Others argue the whole tale was an invention, a parable crafted to frighten children into obedience. But perhaps that is the most disturbing truth, that we cannot tell the difference between legend and reality. The line has blurred too completely, because whether the details were embellished or not, the pattern is real. Families like this did exist. Hidden pockets of America's past are filled with stories of daughters forced into silence, of fathers who turned bloodlines into prisons. This family may have been the most extreme, the most grotesque, but they were not alone. And the shame of those histories explains why so many communities preferred to bury the truth beneath folklore. Better to let it live as a ghost story than to face the fact that it was flesh and blood. The story of the sisters who married their father is not just about inbreeding. It is about power unchecked, about silence that protects cruelty, about how isolation twists the human mind until the unthinkable becomes ordinary. It forces us to ask questions we would rather avoid. How much horror can a family contain before it breaks? And how many people, standing just outside the cabin walls, chose to look away rather than intervene? Perhaps that is why this tale refuses to die. Because on some level, it does not belong to Kentucky alone. It belongs to all of us who have inherited stories our grandparents refused to tell, secrets our towns pretend never happened. The sisters' fate is a mirror held up to the darker side of family, community, and history itself. And now, having heard it, you too are part of the chain that keeps this story alive.